Hello, everyone, and welcome to Valuing the Vote. I am Amy Sandine, and I'm privileged to serve as the board chair for Humanities Nebraska Council, and so happy to be with you here today. Thanks for joining us. This is the first program in a four-part series where you can join people from Nebraska and beyond to explore the hard-fought battles waged historically to give all Americans the right to vote, and to consider the meaning of enfranchisement in the 21st century, and to discuss what the future might hold for civic participation. This Valuing the Vote program is funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we are Humanities Nebraska. We are a nonprofit that helps Nebraskans explore what connects us and makes us human. Humanities Nebraska is funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, an appropriation from the Nebraska legislature, the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, and private donations from generous individuals and entities. Some of you are on this program today. Thank you so much for your support and again for joining us today. We are encouraging questions today, so feel free to put those in the Facebook comments. And also, please let us know where you are from. We know that this is a way that we can reach people across Nebraska and beyond, and we are thrilled to have people from all walks of life join us for these programs. I am pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Dianne Bystrom. She is Director Emerita of the Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women and Politics at Iowa State University. She directed the center for 22 years before retiring in 2018. She also founded Iowa State's Leadership Studies program and served as its director for 10 years. At Iowa State, she taught courses on women and politics, political campaigns, and women in leadership. She has contributed to 25 books, probably more by now, as co-author, co-editor, or chapter author. She has also written journal articles on women in politics, youth voters, and the Iowa caucus. Dr. Bystrom serves as a speaker and commentator about political and women's issues for community groups, professional organizations, and the media. We are delighted that she is also a member of the Humanities Nebraska Speakers Bureau. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism from Kearney State College and a master's degree in journalism and PhD in communication, both from the University of Oklahoma. There is much more than that we could tell you about her, including leadership roles with League of Women Voters and other positions. And I'm going to let her tell you more about what she knows in this wonderful, engaging, and insightful program today. Thank you so much, Dr. Bystrom, for guiding us through this conversation today. I will turn it over to you, and we'll be back for questions at the end. Remember, everyone, you can ask questions in the Facebook comments, and we will get to those after Dr. Bystrom's presentation. And we'll be back for a conversation with her after. So welcome, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Amy. I'm really happy to be here today on behalf of the Humanities Nebraska. I'm glad to kick off this great series on valuing the vote. What I'll be doing today is be giving an overview on the vote. As I think most of you know, August 26, 2020 was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It was going to be celebrated with things all around the country, including in Nebraska, where I am co-president of the League of Women Voters after retiring to the Plattsmouth area. And because of the pandemic, a lot of our celebrations didn't take place. So the National League of Women Voters, as well as the state leagues in Nebraska and across the country, are continuing the celebration of the 19th Amendment passed into 2020 and also 2021. So it's really fun to talk about this. I am going to be sharing a PowerPoint, and I hope I'm listed as a co-host. I'll be coming off and on with this technology here, showing some slides, but also then speaking directly to you. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint at this point. Let's see, technology is great, isn't it? So slideshow from the beginning. So So what I'm going to be talking about today briefly is I'm doing something a little bit differently than some of my previous presentations, and that is sort of this forward looking about women as voters. So I am going to give you the highlights of the national women's suffrage movement, which was 72 years in the making. The interesting thing I found out since moving to Nebraska is that Nebraska also has a very long history of suffrage, actually 64 years, in which we tried at least 4 different times to approve women's suffrage. And so, and we did finally get some limited suffrage here, but never full suffrage until 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the suffrage leaders, not only in the United States, but also in Nebraska. Basically, over that kind of long time period, there would be a first generation of suffrage leaders, most of whom, or all of whom actually, were not alive when the 19th Amendment was ratified. There was a middle group of suffrage leaders, including Carrie, Chapman, Catt. As Amy said, I directed a center named after her. She was an Iowa State graduate. And then went on to be a national leader in the suffrage movement. And then there's a 3rd generation of younger suffrage leaders that would include Doris Stevens from Omaha. But then what I'm going to do also is transition a little bit to talk about women as voters very briefly, and we can deal more with it, I think, in the Q&A, as voters from 1920 to 2020. So that's what we'll be doing. I'm going to start with the beginnings of the suffrage movement. As most historians know, the suffrage movement actually began before 1848 because it was closely aligned with the abolitionist movement. And so there were things going on before 1848. But we need a starting point. So we pick the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, that happened in July 19th and 20th. In 1848, it was organized by Lucretia Mott, who you see there on the left, and also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's seated on the right. And I hope you see the screen the way I do. But anyway, it was a 2-day convention. 240 people attended it. It was limited to women the first day. And so about 200 women attended. That's when they heard the Declaration of Sentiments that was drafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton following the Declaration of Independence, but said that all women and men were created equally. The second day, men could attend. About 40 attended, including Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave and renowned abolitionist. He attended on the second day. And that's when they presented 11 resolutions on basically increasing women's rights, not only in the workplace, but at home, in churches, but it included women's voting rights. That was the most controversial resolution, and it almost didn't pass. People thought that they thought they'd be laughed and ridiculed if they would ask for something like the vote. But Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, we're not going to get all these other rights unless we have the right to vote. So that passed as well. So over the next 19 years, there were 12 women's rights conventions held throughout the country. And this is around the time that after the Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was active in the abolition movement. She was not at Seneca Falls, but they met in about 1851, became lifelong friends, and they actually paired with Frederick Douglass and created the American Equal Rights Association, which was the leading association during that time period with these women's rights conventions. And again, they were advocating for universal suffrage, would mean suffrage for African-American men, African-American women, and white women. So here we have back in Nebraska, where we have our first attempt to be, we would have been the first territory and or state in the nation to have suffrage. It all started with Amelia Jenks Bloomer, pictured here. She lived in Council Bluffs. She was an Iowa suffrage leader. She crossed the river and spoke in Omaha, actually in 1855. People that heard her speak thought that she was so amazing that she should be asked to speak before the territorial legislature, which she was. She spoke on January 8th, 1856. The House was so impressed, it passed women's suffrage on January 25th of 1856. Had it passed in the upper house, we would be the first territory or state to have women's suffrage. However, the session ended without a vote in the upper house because they were doing other business and just didn't take it up. Nebraska was very early in the movement that we call school suffrage. And this was the idea that women could vote in school district elections. Kansas was the first state to have school suffrage, but our territory was the second entity that had school suffrage. It was approved by the territorial legislature in 1867. It didn't take effect until 1869. Then the legislature, by now as a state legislature, backpedaled and decided that school suffrage was only for male citizens and unmarried women. They then extended it once again in 1881 to women of school-age children. So Let's see. So going back to the national movement, and so what was happening then in 1869 is that there was a huge break in the national movement. You had the American Equal Rights Association, again, advocating for universal suffrage, but they split in 1869 over the 14th and especially the 15th Amendment that gave African-American men the right to vote, but did not address the question of women's suffrage. And so the American Equal Rights Association split into two groups. One was the National Women's Suffrage Association. That was a more radical group. It was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They were opposed to the 15th Amendment. They wanted a federal constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. The American Women's Suffrage Association was founded by Lucy Stone and some others. They were more closely aligned with those who supported the 15th Amendment. And they were considered the more conservative group, and they advocated for a state-by-state suffrage. And so that was the difference in the two groups. We do know, however, that Nebraska, even though they, Nebraska at the time, they turned down women's suffrage once. They did have school suffrage, but they were seen as very fertile territory to become the first state to have women's suffrage. And so you had leaders primarily from the National Women's Suffrage Association, but also from the American Women's Suffrage Association that visited Nebraska on behalf of women's suffrage. And in some of my research, which has been kind of, it's ongoing. And so I've been trying to go through newspaper articles and look, and I have found that Susan B. Anthony came to Nebraska quite frequently, starting in 1871 through 1877. And actually in 1871, I found out that she actually visited Plattsmouth. So I don't know if that's one of her first talks in Nebraska, but certainly one of the earlier ones. She also visited Grand Island, Hebron, and Beatrice. And so she, again, was in the state between 1871 and 1877. Hoping that Nebraska would become that first state for women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also visited Nebraska. And in fact, she came and she was basically in Hebron and Beatrice as well. And she helped organize the first suffrage association, local suffrage association in Nebraska with the Thayer County Suffrage Association in 1879. So that was what she was doing. So on the national level, in the same time frame, we have in 1878, that the Women's Suffrage Amendment, which was called at the time the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was first introduced to Congress in 1878. It was voted on from time to time and never approved until 1919 when both houses of Congress passed it. But I think the interesting thing is that the language never changed. The language was the same for 42 years. And so despite attempts from some people to limit it to white women in the writing of it, it never changed in the 42 years. So I'm going to share again my screen, and can you see that, everybody, or not? I'm trying to stay. Let's see. I want to make sure you can see it, so I think I need to do this. So, okay. So, this is not advancing. So we're back in Nebraska now, and so what we have here is that we have, whoops. Oh, goodness. Technology, right? Okay. All right, back in Nebraska. So we have attempts in Nebraska, again, to have women's suffrage. So in 1871, you have delegates gathering because Nebraska is going to become a state. They write a state constitution, which includes women's suffrage as part of the amendments. The Constitution doesn't pass, nor does obviously, the women's suffrage proposal goes down with it. And it got the least amount of votes from the male voters in Nebraska. So they gathered again in 1875 to write a constitution for the state. And this time they decided that they will just deny voting rights to women along with criminals and the mentally ill. So the legislature then in 1881, again, they're still trying. What you see here pictured are Erasmus and Lucy Correll. They were the editors of the pro-suffrage Hebron Journal. And Erasmus was later elected to the legislature, the state legislature. So pro-suffrage, he advocated for a bill in the legislature to remove male from the state constitution, which would effectively give women the right to vote. And so the way he had the bill worded, that it had to go to a vote of the male voters of Nebraska in 1882. So what you see going on then is that the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association was founded. There were suffrage organizations like that throughout the country. So, and they all later became League of Women Voters chapters throughout the country. So then it goes to the voters in 1882. So you have, again, the national leaders thinking, okay, Nebraska is going to be the first state to approve women's suffrage. So you had leaders from the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, both held their national conventions in Omaha. But once again, the male voters of the state rejected the suffrage amendment. And so that was our third attempt, actually, if you count the constitutional conventions that took place. Another leader that you're going to hear more about on Thursday, if you tune into this series, is Clara B. Colby. She was in Beatrice, again, also coming from that newspaper heritage here. And an interesting thing about the women's suffrage movement, particularly in the Western states or Midwest states, is that a lot of it was advocated through journalists, both male and female. So she began publishing the Women's Tribune in 1883, and that was a national publication that was published well into the 1900s. It was later moved from Beatrice to Washington, D.C. Clara was also president of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association. And again, I encourage you, I hope you'll tune in on Thursday when we'll hear more about her extraordinary life as part of this series. Another suffrage leader that I want to call some attention to is Jessie Helm Moss. She was a young African-American social worker in Omaha, and African-American women were excluded from many white organizations, including the Young Women's Christian Association, which we now know as the YWCA. So she founded with others the Negro Women's Christian Association in Omaha in 1890. And we know from newspaper clippings, we don't have a lot of information, at least that I've been able to dig up on this, but we do know that they met in the homes of other prominent African-American women in Omaha, and they supported women's voting rights. So they would have meetings about suffrage and about supporting suffrage, but also they focused, like the National African-American Associations, on other activities like building community, social activities, educational activities. So back on the national level, we see that the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association have now merged. They had, in that time, from 1869 to when they merged together in 1890, they had really no successes. Wyoming as a territory did grant women's suffrage, so that was their one success before 1890. But they really, as this split movement, they didn't have a lot of success. So what you see after they joined together, and here again is Carrie Chapman Catt. Again, she was raised in Charles City, Iowa, a graduate of Iowa State University, which was Iowa Agricultural College at the time. She was active in the Iowa suffrage movement and then became the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association after Susan B. Anthony. She became president in 1900 to 1904, and then she was later the president from 1915 to 1920. But so then they start having, so basically, even though these two associations have different goals, with the national wanting a federal amendment and the American wanting state by state, they decided first they would make concessions and work state by state. So Wyoming was admitted to the Union, so they become now the first state that has women's suffrage in 1890. Colorado quickly followed. What's very unique about Colorado is that this was by a referendum vote. And so Carrie Chapman Catt led that campaign in her role. She wasn't president at the time. She was a campaigner, a speaker in Colorado. So they approved it in 1893. Utah, again, joining the Union with suffrage. The Mormon Church supported suffrage. Then Idaho as well in 1896, and Washington State again in 1910. So in addition to these associations going together, we also then see, after the National American Women's Suffrage Association got together again and started having some success, then you saw associations throughout the country, including Nebraska, have associations against women's suffrage. So 1911, you have the first national association. It was known as a National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, and it was founded in 1911. And people, members of that group tended to be white, usually wealthy women. They also had Southern members of Congress who were opposed to women's suffrage because they did not want African-American women to vote in the South. Also, the liquor industry was really big in the opposition to suffrage. The liquor industry felt, because a suffrage movement was associated with the temperance movement and prohibition. And so they were concerned that if women got the right to vote, then they would vote for prohibition, which they did. And so you had the liquor industry against it. Actually, also the Catholic Church was active in opposing it on a national level as well as a state level. The Nebraska Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage was founded in Omaha in 1914. And again, it was really closely aligned with the Catholic Church in Omaha. In fact, they produced a brochure that was called Lest Catholic Men Be Misled, and accused the suffrage leaders of being opposed to the ideal womanhood of the Virgin Mary. Okay, so okay, now I want to talk a little bit about, again, you could talk for a long time about this, but I want to talk a little bit about some diversity in the suffrage movement. As I mentioned, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was primarily white women, but they did have African-American women who belonged to it and were active in it, and more than the two that I have here. But Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells, both who are pictured here, were active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Mary Church Terrell was a speaker at some of their national conventions. She gave an address once about the double bind that African-American women fill as far as their rights in the United States. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a leader in the anti-lynching movement, later moved to Chicago. But those two women together founded the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. So while they remained active in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they founded an association for colored women that not only supporting voting rights, but beyond that, because they were facing more discriminations in society. So they had this organization that worked on behalf of job equity, pay equity, education, and childcare. On the militant side, and here we have pictured Dora Stevens, and she is a militant activist from born and raised in Omaha. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns were the more militant. That was that third generation of suffrage leaders. They had been educated in Great Britain, where the suffrage movement was much more militant. They organized, they came back to the United States and did join the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They organized a huge parade in Washington, D.C. In 1913. And then they left the association because they felt it wasn't militant enough. And they founded the National Women's Party. And that was a group that picketed at the White House from 1917 to 1918. They picketed against World War I. They picketed against Woodrow Wilson. First Woodrow Wilson kind of tolerated it, but then he got irritated and embarrassed. And so they were later arrested and jailed for their protests, including Dora Stevens. And news leaked out about their treatment in prison. They were force-fed, they went on hunger strikes. And that again helped from the left push Woodrow Wilson in being more supportive for women's suffrage. Okay. So we're back, and what happened now is that so things kind of progressed state by state with the suffrage movement. So you have states, and again, primarily in the West. So from 1911 to 1914, you have California granting women's suffrage, you have Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona, and then you also have Nevada and Montana. And so you have some progress against states approving women's suffrage. So back in Nebraska, so now we're back in Nebraska to see what's going on here. And so we have yet another attempt for women's suffrage. And this time we have the legislature looking at a suffrage bill in 1913. It fails by one vote, but a petition places women's suffrage amendment on the ballot for the 1914 election. Again, there was a lot of opposition by the Nebraska Association opposed to women's suffrage in the Catholic Church. There was, again, a lot of pro-suffrage activities. Here is a picture from a suffrage parade that took place in Blair, Nebraska in 1914. And yet again, the women's suffrage was defeated in Nebraska by a 6-point margin. So it's getting closer, but still not getting passed. So back on the national level, we have Carrie Chapman Catt again. And So Carrie Chapman Catt, at the time, before 1915, actually had turned to working for international women's suffrage. And the suffrage movement was kind of in bad shape going into 1915. And so basically Catt was known as a great organizer, and so she was asked to come back in, serve as president. She began her second term as president in 1915. This actually there's her picture, but off to the left is a parade that she organized in New York City in 1915. Her goal was to get one state east of the Mississippi River to grant women's suffrage on a statewide basis. And she focused on New York State, feeling it would be the most influential. So she became president in 1915. In 1916, she had an address to the National Convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and she announced her winning plan. It was a plan that primarily, it focused on the federal amendment, but it also said we'll work on statewide suffrage where it makes sense. And the thing that was so great about that is that she really was laying the groundwork for ratification. And so she would work in states where she could get some, like a state like Nebraska, where at least they had they ended up having presidential electors in 1917. And so she was, interested in working in the states, but the goal was the federal constitutional amendment. Her campaign was funded by a bequest of $1 million from Miriam Leslie, who was a publisher, a woman publisher in New York City. That would have been worth about $25 million today. So it was a well-financed campaign. She led the New York campaign also in 1917. That was successful. It failed in New York in 1915. Suffrage was approved by New York in 1917. And that really did help influence Woodrow Wilson as well as other members of Congress that suffrage was coming. Carrie Chapman Catt proposed the League of Women Voters in 1919. And in my view, she was already sensing that they were going to be successful. And she felt like women needed to be educated and encouraged and empowered to vote. So she proposed the League in 1919 as a nonpartisan educational institution or organization, and we remain nonpartisan and educational until today. And then she formally established the League of Women Voters in 1920, actually in a convention in Chicago on Valentine's Day. So another interesting thing to note here is that millions of women actually enjoyed the right to vote before the 19th Amendment was passed. Women had full voting rights in 15 states in the Alaska Territory before the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. And they had limited suffrage, including in Nebraska, in another 12 states before 1920. So their influence really helped build momentum for the 19th Amendment. So here we are back in Nebraska, and we have yet another attempt to approve the 19th Amendment. So in 1917, with the support of pro-suffrage Governor Keith Neville, Nebraska passed suffrage for women to vote in city elections and as presidential electors. So they already had the right to vote in school elections, but now they would have the right to vote in city elections and for presidential electors. So the only thing they couldn't vote for would be basically state legislature and statewide offices. So it passed. But there was an anti-suffrage ballot against it. They collected signatures to basically take it off the ballot in the fall, and that failed. I should note also that Morrell Keith Neville, who is the pro-suffrage governor, is my husband, Keith Neville Bystrom's grandfather. And so we have a lot of pride in our family about his pro-suffrage stance on behalf of women in Nebraska. So the ballot referendum failed. So the action by the legislature stood. And in 1919, Nebraska women could vote in local elections. So far, I know that they did vote in a sewage bond election in Geneva, which was approved, and more women than men cast their ballots there. And I recently learned that they also voted in an election in Plattsmouth for mayor. So other women's suffrage leaders, Catherine Sumney and Grace Richardson, they were two members of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association that found all these fraudulent signatures on the anti-suffrage ballot referendum, and so helped defeat that referendum. Pictured here is Margaretta Shaw Stewart Dietrich of Hastings. She was the last president of the Nebraska Women's Suffrage Association and the first president of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. And as I mentioned earlier, all these new women's suffrage associations that had been organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association across the country then became chapters of the League of Women Voters. Margaretta was married to the governor of Nebraska, who later was appointed to the US Senate. So women's suffrage movement finally in 1919, the House of Representatives finally passed the Women's Suffrage Amendment, which would become the 19th Amendment. The Senate occurred. This just gives you an idea of states quickly coming, starting in June 10th of 1919, and Nebraska, which is highlighted here, became the 14th state to ratify the 19th Amendment on August 2nd, 1919. It continued again in 1920 until it kind of came at a full stop with West Virginia on March 10th of 1920. Now, to add an amendment to the Constitution, it requires 3/4 ratification by the states. In 1920, there were 48 states, so it required 36 states to ratify the amendment. And West Virginia was the 35th state. So what happened then is that we're looking for what can become that 36th state. And what the suffrage leaders chose was Tennessee. They didn't have a lot of choices. There were some state legislatures that didn't meet every year. So there were some legislatures that weren't meeting in 1920. There were others that informed suffrage leaders that we're not going to vote for this. So they had pretty slim pickings about what could be the 36th state. So they thought that their best chance was in Tennessee. Now, in some ways, it seems like Tennessee, how could that be a great choice? It was in the South. There were Southern congressmen against suffrage. In the state of Tennessee, there was a big anti-suffrage organization, but there are also a very active suffragist organization, which included not only white women, but African-American women like Frankie Pierce. And so it was a very vibrant movement there. Also, like Nebraska, Tennessee had presidential suffrage. And so, that made it a little bit more likely. So the pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage activists landed in Nashville, Tennessee, with a very heated campaign. This is an ad that the anti-suffrage people took out against Carrie Chapman Catt in the Nashville and Chattanooga papers. They criticized her for something she wrote for the NAACP's journal, The Crisis, advocating that all people should have the right to vote regardless of sex or race or ethnicity. And so they criticized her for that very openly. This is one of my favorite stories about the suffrage movement. And so the ratification resolution passed the state Senate pretty easily on August 13th. So all eyes were on the House, which decided they were going to vote on August 18th. And so the suffrage leaders were keeping track of what the vote would be like. And it was made easier by the fact that if you were opposed to women's suffrage, you would wear a red rose. And if you were pro-women's suffrage, you would wear a yellow rose. Hence my yellow roses in my background today is a symbol of the suffrage movement. So when they were doing the count, they thought it would be deadlocked and they were going to take the vote on the 18th. They weren't able to get any more extensions, and they really thought it was going to go down in defeat, because if it was a tied vote, then it would be broken. The vote would be broken by the Speaker of the House, who was anti-suffrage. So this is Harry Byrne. Harry Byrne was the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, 24 years old, from Eastern Tennessee. He was personally in favor of women's suffrage, but he was told that his constituents in the more conservative part of the state would not support women's suffrage. So he planned to vote against it and was wearing a red rose. This is actually the envelope. This is a telegram that he received from his mother, Feb, and it's dated on August 17th, but so it came the day before the vote. So I have some of the text here. Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification, your mother. And he decided to vote pro-suffrage. He voted for women's suffrage, and women's suffrage won by that vote in the Tennessee legislature. So nationally, we have the 19th Amendment certified on August 26, 1920. It's still celebrated as Women's Equality Day. Carrie Chapman Catt, who's pictured here in Time magazine, gave a speech that day talking about the vote as their emblem of equality, the guarantee of women's liberty. And, I noted that also that she talked about, in these 72 years that women have suffered an agony of the soul, which, a lot of people couldn't comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. The vote has been costly, prize it. And she ended her speech with, progress is calling on you to make no pause, act. And again, she knew that women not only needed to fight for the right to vote, but then they needed to be educated, enlightened, empowered, encouraged to vote. In 1920, the presidential year election, of course, women only got the right to vote at the end of August. So just in a few months are getting to vote for the first time. 27 million women were enfranchised. That included Black women in 34 states. And these were the 34 out of the 48 states that did not have barriers to Black men voting. After the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, many Southern states put up barriers to Black men voting. And so Black men and women continued to be disenfranchised primarily in the Southern United States until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And at the time in 1920, even though Black men and women could vote in 34 states, most African Americans lived in the southeastern states that had barriers. And some Indigenous women also could vote in 1920. So where are we today? So what we have is that in 1920, you had a fairly low percentage of women voting, about 36%. And there wasn't a lot of records kept around that time. We know from a few studies that, for example, in Missouri and Kentucky, 50% of women were voting there, about the same percentage of men, because those states didn't have a lot of voting barriers and they had a lot of competitive races. And then you had states like Virginia, which had a lot of barriers to voting, early registration deadlines. In fact, I think the deadline was to register was even before women got the right to vote. And so only about 5% of women voted. What you have though by 1964 is that more women than men had voted in every presidential election since 1964. And in 2016, the most recent election that we have firm data for, about 10 million more women voted than men. And so that's why you hear a lot about women voters. So in 1980, so women make up more of the US population than men. So it's also important to look at this in terms of percentage. So from 1980 and on, a greater percentage of women have voted than men. And again, in 2016, this was a 4% difference. 63% of women voted versus 59% of men. We are still getting information on the turnout in 2020. It was an interesting year. We typically get this information from exit polls, but since so many people voted by mail this year, that the Edison, where I get my data from, they did sample people who voted by mail as well as people who walked out of the ballot boxes of poll places on election day. It's been widely estimated by many organizations that track voting that we were going to have a record voter turnout this year of almost 67%. That will be the biggest percentage vote turnout since 1908. And we do know right now too, that right now women again are tracking about voting about 4% more than men. So that is my presentation. I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Dianne, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I can tell that you're just bursting to share more because you've got so much in your head.
Oh.
Seeing all of those names, I was scribbling frantically. I want to do research and find out more about all of these people, mostly women, who had integral roles in really bringing this to light over such a long period. And a couple of people commented, Ellen said, women's suffrage is a clear example that shows the value of persistence when making societal change. She says the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, as MLK reminded us. And Chris piggybacked on that in a comment and question where he asks a question that we would like to hear your perspective on. He says, how far along that arc do you think we are for gender equality in politics and civic life here in the US?
Well, as someone once said, it's kind of like ketchup coming out of a bottle, kind of drip, drip, drip. And so we make continual progress, but it's slow progress. And so it was back really in 1992, which was called the Year of the Women Voter, which just happened to be in my database for my dissertation. So it was kind of just by happenstance. And so that was when we first saw the first, probably the greatest increase percentage-wise in the number of women in the US Congress. after 2020, we're going to see another record year. It's inched up again. I think it was, and there's still some races to be decided. I think it's gone from 127, which was about a 23 point something percent of the Congress overall, and it'll be slightly over 25%. So here we are today with slightly over 25%. One of the things that's interesting is that Republican women really increased their share, especially in the U.S. House. They have a new record there. I think there's 30 Republican women. And I think that's important to note because the progress of women in politics, especially at the legislative level in state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress, has kind of been on the with Democratic women, and we're not going to reach that equity unless we have more Republican women running and being successful. On the other thing is, you can't help but notice that we have a woman vice president, and so that is again a major win. We've had 2 women run for vice president before, one Republican and one Democrat. Those tickets were not the winning tickets. And so I think the fact that Kamala Harris will be the first woman, the first African-American woman, the first East Indian woman, the first woman of color, and I think the first child of immigrants, although there could be some men that might have been child of immigrants, I don't know. But I think that's important because what we know from research is that there's a very strong role modeling effect that cuts across party lines. So for example, what happened in 2016 when a lot of people, including myself, thought thought Hillary Clinton would win. And so then when she didn't win, and I was at the Catt Center at the time, and we were doing our Ready to Run campaign school, we thought, oh my gosh, people aren't going to want to come to this. They're going to be so devastated. And what we saw is we had, the day after the election to that Sunday, and we hadn't announced Ready to Run yet. We hadn't announced the dates yet. It was going to be in the spring. And we thought, well, we'll do our marketing based around the first woman president. And we had something like 93 emails and calls from people saying, when's your next Ready to Run? And we had more than 170 people participate in our 2017 Ready to Run campaign school. And so, including some of the people that were elected in Iowa, Cindy Axne that was reelected, Abby Finkenauer, who was defeated, has been involved with that. And so Teresa Greenfield and Joni Ernst both participated in Ready to Run, and that was a woman v. woman race. And so we saw not only in Iowa, but across the nation, more women interested in being involved with politics. And then we saw a record turnout of women in 2018 running for office. And so in that year, we saw a lot of women of color and a lot of women who had military backgrounds. And so we saw that in 2018. So in 2020, we had another record number of women running and being elected to Congress. And then again, our first woman vice president, which to round about this answer is that I think that Kamala Harris's election, as you say, you can't be it if you can't see it. That's so I think young women seeing her, and again, looking at the research on role modeling, it cuts across party lines. So even, if you see a woman, whether they be Democrat or Republican, that really has an impact on young women, either Democrats or Republicans, seeing that I can do this. And so I think her election will have another effect on more women running, not only for national office, but for state office.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. There's so much that we're seeing now. And one note to the audience, if you have questions, we will we'll respond to the questions that we can. So please put those in the comments on the Facebook Live comments there, and we'll try and get to your question. Looking at the numbers of women now who have been elected to office, including Kamala Harris and all these others that you mentioned, those are inspirational, motivational role models. Sherilyn noted that she wished that more of this would be taught in schools. She mentioned junior high schools in specific. And as I said, I was madly scribbling all of these names, some of which I had heard of, but of course, I think most people know Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, maybe Lucretia Mott. Do you see change happening in schools where more of the narrative is being taught as part of that to empower more people who maybe don't look like what we think of as a typical elected leader. One, do you think that has an effect? And two, do you think it's starting to happen in our schools, that it is that broader narrative?
Well, I can only speak anecdotally. As you know, education, especially public education, is state-based controlled in our country. What I can tell you is that when I was in Iowa, the 22 years I was there, several years before I retired, the Department of Education reached out to me and others because the person who was in charge of social studies for the Iowa Department of Education felt like there wasn't enough about the suffrage movement in the curriculum. And so she met with people across the state. It actually wound up, so they changed their curriculum. So Iowa changed their curriculum in many ways. And so their state-based curriculum, but it had more emphasis on women's suffrage. And then growing out of that, I was asked by the Secretary of State's office in Iowa to write a suffrage curriculum, which I did, and it's available to any teachers here in Nebraska. It's available online for free with PowerPoints and everything on the Secretary of State's website in Iowa. So I did Suffrage 101, which focuses on the suffrage movement and has stuff about Iowa, not Nebraska in it. And then I did another one on just women's political participation today. So that's on the Secretary of State's website. The Secretary of State in Nebraska has a curriculum that he started first with Iowa Caucus. And so I think there's a total of 12 lesson plans for high school teachers that have to do. And so again, they're available. And speaking of Nebraska, to give another shout out here, the all-girls Catholic high schools in Omaha have been very, very much involved in having a 19th Amendment program. So I was invited by Susie Sisson, who I kind of met through, I think someone referred her to me, and she's at Marion High School. And so I think she teaches English and women's studies. So I've actually been meeting with her for more than a year, and the Catholic schools had planned this huge leadership conference, and then of course pandemic hit, but we went forward. And so we've done several virtual things this fall. I did something with them on Women's Equality Day. I did something at Duchenne. And then let's say on election day, they had a panel on women in politics I moderated that was a broadcast to all the Catholic schools. So it had an audience of about 1,600, both live and taped. And so I am seeing that. And so I guess I'd tell all of you out here, if you're teachers, I'm happy to share anything to you. I'm happy to talk to your classes via Zoom. I really enjoy talking to students. That's the biggest thing you miss when you retire from academics.
Wonderful. And I will just add that as a member of the Speakers Bureau with Humanities Nebraska, if anyone is interested in reaching out to take advantage of this offer, you can find Dr. Bystrom through Humanities Nebraska Speakers Bureau and just book it that way too. So thank you for making that offer. Let's get you talking to more people, because this is wonderful. I do want to note that this is another shout out for role models. Eliza in Arizona said she's hopeful Kamala makes an impression on young women like Eleanor Roosevelt had on me as a young girl. So it does happen, we know. And then Judy asks this question: did the Voting Rights Act of '65 and the later gutting of the act affect women's voting rights?
Yes. And so I think the thing about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and so one of the things that happened after the 19th Amendment was ratified, as I said, African-American women could vote, but most of them lived in places where they couldn't vote. And so in some ways, in many ways, the movement of African-American women did not end with the 19th Amendment. In fact, they went into the civil rights movement, and they fought in the South for women's, for African-American voting rights, which ended with the approval, the passage by Congress of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that had a huge impact, and I don't have the figures on top of my head, but the percentage of African-Americans voting, both male and female, went up after 1965, went gradually up because those barriers were being removed. Barriers like poll taxes, literacy tests, and sometimes just outright violence and threats of violence. And so African Americans' voting rights improved after 1965, which what I do know off the top of my head is that African-American women, when you compare them to white women who were, voting all this time, their voting percentages are about the same percentage of African-American women vote as white women. And so when you look at that trajectory, and I've got some charts on that, is that they've really improved since 1965. But what I want to point out is that sometimes, I speak to people, and it's like, we had the 19th Amendment, 1920, now not everybody can vote. And then we had, 1965, and now everybody can vote. There is still voter suppression in this country, and it didn't end. And so people don't realize, or at least I think many people realize, but we need to recognize that the Voting Rights Act was pretty much gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013 in a 5-4 decision called Shelby County versus Holder. And so the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Roberts, basically said they had something called pre-clearance, and not to get into the weeds here, but there were some states that couldn't change their voting laws without getting pre-clearance from the Department of Justice. And there are more than 10 states that have discriminated against people of color. So Justice Roberts said, we don't think pre-clearance is unconstitutional, but we think it's outdated. So Congress needs to come up with a new criteria. So they threw it to Congress. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, you saw a lot of references to her strong dissent, which she read from the bench in Shelby County versus Holder, saying she very much opposed to the decision. And so she likened it to throwing away your umbrella while standing in a storm because you weren't getting wet. And so anyway, the Congress has attempted to do something about it. They have the Voting Rights Act now. I think it's the Voting Acts Reenactment Act. I can't remember the name of it. It's named after John Lewis now. The House has passed it, and it's just sitting in the Senate. So
I'm again scribbling because I want to do more research about Shelby County versus Holder and see what's going on now, because this is it's so timely. We're all thinking about these things if we leave our houses at all. I think we have time for one more question, and this is a little bit of a tributary and a wonderful topic to make a further connection. So Edgar asks, what is the connection to National Grange and the Granger movement?
I'm going to have to tell Edgar, I don't know. I don't know enough about the Granger movement to know that. I do know the women's suffrage movement was very diverse, not only in reaching out to, basically they were very much supported by some of these rural movements. They, in the West, the reason there were so many states that would approve statewide suffrage is that there wasn't as much political partisanship, and there was a more of a progressive movement. But I'm afraid I don't know enough about the Granger movement. I'll certainly look into it, but I try to be a jack of all trades, or a Jill of all trades, but I don't know enough about it to answer that question in any sort of intelligence on it. So I'm sorry. And maybe Edgar asked it because he knows.
Well, I'm going to follow up with Edgar and find out more. See what he's got in mind about that. And another quick question, as we're talking about the history and current affairs as well, Guillermo asks, what about Latino women? So in terms of that trajectory and what results we know now, do you have information on how that plays into the current reality?
Why, yes, I do, on Latino women. And so the interesting thing so Latino women, and particularly Asian women, have a lower voter turnout percentage-wise than African-American women and white women. But going into the 2020 election, Hispanic Americans, because of their population growth, had the potential to be the largest voting bloc of people of color. And so what I've seen so far, and again, it's a little bit more difficult this year because, again, most elections are, you go to the polls, you get your data the next day. And so most of it now is a little mixed up. I mean, there's some good data coming in, but what I've seen with Hispanic women is that they did pretty significantly increase their vote share in 2020. So did African-American men, so did Hispanic men, but not by as big a percent. I don't have those figures in front of me right now. I actually shared them in my last Humanities Nebraska presentation to the Cass County Historical Society. So I have those, but I know that it was a fairly significant increase. I want to say 5 percentage points. And so I think that will just grow. And so there was a growth among that community. They're still not at the same percentage of African-American women and men, but they're getting closer. And they certainly, again, increased in this last election. And I feel like we're just going to be seeing that increasingly. Now, as all of you know, the Hispanics are very diverse. I mean, no group is a monolith, you know, and so, but you a lot of differences in the Hispanic community between people that were from Cuba versus El Salvador, you know, versus Mexico. And so it's a little bit more diverse in these areas. I think, as most people have heard with the media, is that Donald Trump did better this year with Cuban Americans in Florida. He did a little bit better actually with Mexican Americans along the Rio Grande River, but then in Nevada and particularly Arizona, Joe Biden did well with Hispanic voters, and in California.
There's so many threads and fibers that interweave this tapestry of people and opinions and variables that have come into play throughout the history of what we're talking about. And this year, there are new threads that we're weaving into everything. As we keep saying, there's disclaimers, we're flexible, we're adaptable, even more than we've ever been. And we're always learning. And we've learned so much from you. This is really, really fantastic. And as you say, there is so much more to learn. And luckily we have opportunities to do that, which I am going to tell you all about in a minute here. But first, Dr. Bystrom, I really just want to say how grateful I am to you and how much we at Humanities Nebraska appreciate your scholarship, your time, your dedication, and your obvious passion for what you know and wanting to share that. So my gratitude, our gratitude goes to you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I've enjoyed working with Humanities Nebraska since my retirement. So it gives me great things to do in my spare time.
Good. I hope we can have a conversation like this again. And I will let you all know that there are more conversations to be had. You can register for reminders and book and DVD drawings. You can win prizes if you go to humanitiesnebraska.org/vote and register there for the upcoming programs. There will be one this Thursday at 2 p.m. Central Time. Lauren Riesdell presents Clues to Clara Bewick Colby, the rediscovery of local women's history. So again, more people to learn about in this movement, and Laureen can tell you more about that on Thursday. December 1st, also at 2 p.m. Central Time, Sally Bisson-Best presents Nebraska's forgotten suffrage leader, Doris Stevens. So another one that we can learn about. And December 3rd at 2 p.m. Central Time, more on women in the vote. So November 19, December 1, and December 3 are the upcoming programs in this series of Valuing the Vote. And once again, I hope that you will join us again. I hope you'll do your own research and share what you've learned here today. Invite people to sign up at humanitiesnebraska.org/vote to join us for the future programs, register for those, and be eligible for drawings of books and DVDs. So thank you again, Dianne, Dr. Bystrom, you're amazing. Thank you to Mary, Christy, and Sherry Lynn at Humanities Nebraska, and Chris for pulling this together and creating this 4-part series. Thanks to all of you for joining us, for supporting Humanities Nebraska. If you're interested in supporting more programs like this, you can easily donate online or contact someone at the office and they'll tell you how you can be involved. We really do hope you will join us again on Thursday at 2 o'clock for the next program in Valuing the Vote. Have a wonderful day and go forth and learn more. Thanks for joining us.